Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to We Begin with a Story. But before we begin, we kindly ask you to turn off your cell phones and all other electronic devices. The event opens with a story, so we invite you to settle in, get comfortable, and let the words guide your imagination for the next few minutes.
A long, long time ago, in a far-away land, there was known to be a vast kingdom. We believe that this mighty kingdom stretched from the foothills of the snowy Himalayas all the way along the lush river valleys and stopped at the thundering Bay of Bengal. The residents of this bountiful land were happy and healthy, and the kingdom prospered under its two rulers. Yes, two rulers. Does that sound surprising to you? It is rare to hear of a kingdom being governed peacefully by two kings. So why don't we dive in to take a closer look and see for ourselves how long they managed to keep the peace intact? So let us journey to Hastinapur, the heart of this glorious land situated along the river Ganges. The Kuru dynasty had been ruling it for centuries, leading up to our present-day rulers Dhritarashtra and Pandu. They are step-brothers, and though Dhritarashtra, being the oldest, should have been the sole ruler, he was born blind. Therefore, to maintain the integrity of the kingdom, Pandu, his younger brother, is in charge of ruling the kingdom on his older brother's behalf. Though these two brothers and their wives happily shared their claims to the throne for the sake of the kingdom's peace and prosperity, their children did not share the same feelings. Pandu, the younger brother, had 5 sons and were referred to everyone as Pandavas, the sons of Pandu. They were loved for being gentle, kind, respectful, and very well-mannered. Now, shortly after the Pandavas were born, Dhritarashtra's wife gave birth to a stillborn ball of flesh. She felt heartbroken and was filled with jealousy, thinking that Pandu's sons would inherit the kingdom while her lineage disappeared. She could not let that happen. Just then, a wise old man magically appeared in her bedroom. He said, "O Gandhari, Queen Mother, do not despair. Ask your maid to put this ball of flesh in a jar of fresh water. Soon it will break up and form 100 fetuses. Then place each fetus in a separate jar filled with milk." The maid followed the instructions, and just as the sage foretold, a few months later, Gandhari gave birth to 100 sons this way. They were henceforth known as the Kauravas, princes of the Kuru dynasty. Although both Pandavas and Kauravas were growing up side by side, the Pandavas always received more love and attention. And why not? They were eager learners, so their teachers took extra care when training them on the art of warfare and knowledge of the scriptures. The rigorous training helped them gain incredible skills, and soon deeds of their heroic adventures spread far beyond the palace walls. The citizens were overjoyed by these tales, and they started hailing the Pandava brothers as their next rulers. This news angered the Kauravas to no end. They could not allow the throne to pass from their father to their cousins. So, with the help of their evil-minded uncle, they hatched a plot to overthrow the Pandavas in a game of dice. Now, their uncle was a well known expert in this game, and after years of practice and a skillful tampering of the dice, he could command the dice to roll into any pattern he wished. However, Kauravas kept the involvement of their uncle a secret. Being innocent to their evil plans, the good natured Pandavas happily accepted the offer. But on the day of the game, when the Pandavas arrived at the designated room, they were surprised to see Uncle Shakuni seated there in front of the Kauravas. As soon as the Pandavas entered, the eldest among the Kauravas, Duryodhan, stepped up to address them. Even though we will place the bets, our uncle will roll the dice for us. The Pandavas could sense that something was not right. Still, at the behest of their cousins, they agreed to play along. The game went exactly as the Kauravas had planned. One by one, the Pandavas started gambling their possessions, and Shakuni kept winning them all. Seeing what was happening, the elders tried to intervene. So Uncle Shakuni paused the game to instead mock the Pandavas for being sore losers. The Kauravas joined their uncle too. Sneeringly, Duryodhan commented, "Oh dear brothers, so you need others to protect your riches for you. We won them fair and square, but we are kind enough to consider returning it to you. We have only one condition. You can agree to a final bet where if you win, we will return all your wealth to you. However, if you lose, we get to keep all your possessions, and you will leave our kingdom and not return for 13 years. Or if you are scared by this, you can simply accept your status as losers." The Pandavas were inflamed by Duryodhan's words and decided to place their luck on the dice for one more time. And again, with a tiny flick of his wrist, Uncle Shakuni won the round. The Pandavas were left with no option but to accept the condition. Their parents tried to dissuade them, but as honorable men, they were determined to carry out their promises. So, to torture them a little more, Duryodhan declared, the Pandavas would need to spend the first 12 years of their exile in the forest living off the land. For the last 1 year, they will need to be back in society but assume a different identity so that no one can recognize them. If their identity is revealed, the punishment will restart from the very beginning. And until the Pandavas are free, the Kauravas will rule the kingdom. Thus began the Pandavas' period of exile. They journeyed deep into the forest and started living among tribesmen. Slowly, they started learning more and more about the simple lives of these villages and the stories they told each other. For example, one evening they came across the story of the clever grandma. She needed to cross a dense forest to visit her daughter. On the way, a ferocious tiger attacked her. But the clever grandma could convince the animal to wait until she returns from her daughter's house, when she will be much plumper and tastier from eating all the good food. When it was time for her to return, though, her daughter carved out a huge pumpkin, placed the old lady inside it, and rolled her down the path, knowing the tiger would not be interested in eating a vegetable. Hearing stories like these kept the Pandavas entertained, and they often wondered about the origin of these fables in their free time. As Pandavas live out their days in the forest, why don't we take a break ourselves to find out more on the origins of stories and storytelling? Let us welcome Lydia, my co host of this evening, to share her insights on this.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to R, a student-led science outreach platform at Champalimaud Foundation. I am Lydia, a research technician at the Systems Neuroscience Lab, and together with Sayali, a PhD student at the Innate Behavioral Lab, and our storyteller for tonight, we will be your hosts this evening. Feel free to submit questions throughout the event using the QR code that's there, in either English or Portuguese. We'll discuss a selection of them during the Q&A at the end. Stories seem to have a unique power over us. Even in science, where knowledge is often communicated through data and statistics, it is frequently the stories behind them that we remember. Stories and humanity are deeply intertwined, and we are here to spend an evening exploring why stories matter. When I first saw François Truffaut's Fahrenheit 451 as a child, I was shocked. How could anyone want to burn books this rich, mind-travel-inducing storytelling objects? In Fahrenheit 451, originally a novel by Ray Bradbury, books are burned because they are thought to disturb society, because stories are powerful and dangerous. But what exactly is a story? A story is more than a sequence of events. In life that is often chaotic and difficult to understand, stories help us make sense of our experiences and create shared meanings. As an example, a person leaves home, faces challenges, and eventually returns transformed. Those events become a story when we interpret them through a shared lens, perhaps a coming-of-age tale, a spiritual quest, a lesson about courage, or a warning about ambition. At its heart, Fahrenheit 451 imagines a society in which those in power try to eliminate stories in order to make people mindless followers. But soon, people start to feel their absence. Even though books are burned, stories survive in people. Individuals begin to memorize entire books and recite them to others. Perhaps that is why this story stayed with me for so many years. Bradbury imagines a society that seeks to eliminate disagreements and differences rather than accept them as part of human life. Stories become a threat because they encourage people to think differently, remember differently, and imagine alternatives. By destroying stories, the regime hopes to create a more uniform, predictable, and compliant society. Fahrenheit 451 reminds us that the true home of stories is not the page, but the human mind. Speech does not leave a fossil record. Still, it is believed that human storytelling began orally. Long before writing was invented, it is believed stories were told around fires, sung, performed, memorized. It is believed long before writing and books, humans were already transmitting knowledge to narratives through myths, rituals, chants, gestures, images. More than 30,000 years ago, humans painted animals on the walls of Chauveau-Pontard cave. These images may be among the earliest traces of humanity's impulse to create meaning through stories. And although the oldest writings that survive to our days were mere record keeping, Soon stories started to be set down in writing, like the Noah's Ark, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and Odyssey. Nevertheless, many folk tales remained in oral tradition for centuries before being written down. For example, by the Brothers Grimm in the 19th century. It is important to mention, though, that literacy wasn't very widespread until this century. In a way, this is exactly what happens in Fahrenheit 451. When books disappear, storytelling does not disappear with them. It simply returns to an older form: memory, recitation, and oral transmission. Across cultures and throughout history, people told different stories, interpreted similar stories in different ways. Yet the act of constructing narratives appears to be universal. That persistence suggests storytelling is doing something important for us. Anthropologists and historians have often argued that storytelling provided an evolutionary advantage. One did not need to encounter the dangerous animal or poisonous plants firsthand if someone else could narrate the encounter. One did not need to repeat every mistake if knowledge could be remembered and transmitted collectively. The literary scholar Jonathan Gottschall describes humans as storytelling animals. He argues that storytelling is one of the primary ways humans make sense of experience, remember the past, and imagine possible futures. In this sense, storytelling became a powerful technology of memory. And eventually, storytelling became something even more important, a technology of cooperation and a technology of community. Humans can cooperate in very large groups, mainly because we believe in shared narratives, shared myths, shared histories, shared symbols. Once dismissed as simple entertainment by the academic community, folk tales are now being studied as cultural lineages. Using methods originally developed to reconstruct biological evolution, researchers have traced how stories spread, change, and survive across populations. Some stories appear almost to behave like living organisms. They branch into variants, adapt to new environments, disappear in some parts, and persist in others. One good example is the folk tale known as The Smith and the Devil. The story tells of a blacksmith who acquires extraordinary abilities by making a pact with a supernatural being. But when the time comes to repay the debt, the blacksmith repeatedly outwits the adversary through cunning and trickery. The choice of a blacksmith is not accidental. The tale likely emerged after the invention of metallurgy, when metal workers possessed rare and highly valued skills that may have seemed almost magical to others. Comparing dozens of versions of this tale across Indo-European-speaking societies, researchers found that its distribution closely mirrors the language relationships shown here. Darker notes indicate a higher probability that the tale was already present in an ancestral population, while colors represent the different language branches. Together, this analysis suggests that the tale traveled alongside populations as they diversified over time. As it moved across regions, it adapted to local cultures. For example, in Christian Europe, the blacksmith is often bargaining with the devil, while in South Asia, the supernatural figure reflects local religious traditions. The details change, but the underlying structure remains recognizable. Accordingly, the tale may date back to Proto-Indo-European times, more than 4,000 years ago in the Bronze Age, and so being older than many of the cultures that tell it today. And the story continues to evolve. A modern retelling can be found in 2017's Netflix film Elementary, The Blacksmith and the Devil. Think about that for a moment. A narrative surviving not through books, libraries, or archives, but through human memory, retelling, and cultural transmission. In some ways, it resembles the world imagined in Fahrenheit 451, stories preserved by people rather than by paper. Stories move with people. As they travel across borders, languages, and generations, they are reshaped by local cultures. Yet some themes persist: conflicts and reconciliation, transformation and growth, belonging and exclusion, justice and injustice, love and loss, fear, death, and survival. In this way, stories reveal both cultural diversity and shared human concerns. This raises an interesting question. Why do some parts of a story change so easily while others remain remarkably stable? And why do some stories continue to be retold while countless others disappear? These are some of the questions that our guest, Joe Stubblefield, senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Winchester, UK, will be addressing. Anthropologists like Claude Lévi-Strauss suggested that recurring patterns in myths may reflect common features of human thought. If so, stories are not only cultural artifacts. They may also offer a window into how our minds work. This is one of the topics that Boudica Belana, Associate Professor in Psychology and Cognitive Neuroscience at York University, Canada, will explore later this evening. So, stories are never static. They evolve. Each generation inherits stories from the past, reshapes them, and adapts them to new circumstances. Even now, in the age of algorithms and social media, humans continue to organize reality to narratives. The forms change, the technologies change, but the human impulse to narrate remains. Perhaps this is why storytelling is so powerful. It allows memory, knowledge, values, fears, and hopes to travel beyond the limits of any individual life. It connects people across generations, cultures, and time. Perhaps this is why the world imagined in Fahrenheit 451 feels so unsettling. In Bradbury's world, books are dangerous because they preserve stories, and stories encourage people to think differently, remember differently, and imagine alternatives. Destroying books is not only an attack on knowledge, it is an attack on the shared narratives that give communities a sense of identity, purpose, and belonging. And yet, in Fahrenheit 451, storytelling survives. The books disappear, the medium changes, but people continue to remember, retell, and share. And perhaps that is the most remarkable thing about storytelling. Stories do not survive because they are written down. They survive because people keep telling them. Thank you.
Thank you, Lydia, for highlighting the importance of storytelling. Just like she mentioned, stories help us relate and associate because every so often they carry themes that do not fade into irrelevance, like the Pandavas deciding to stake their possessions in a gamble under provocation. 12 long years have passed since we last met the five brothers. Their period of exile in the forest is almost over, and they are now preparing for the last year of exile in disguise. They know that they have to be extremely careful to not get caught, as the Kauravas are bound to have their spies posted everywhere. And in case you forgot, if the Kauravas manage to identify their cousins during this period, the loop of exiles will again start for the Pandavas. So, in order to go incognito, each of the five brothers comes up with a story to hide their true identities. They decide to take refuge in a neighboring kingdom and serve the king there. Yudhishthir, being the oldest and the wisest, chooses the guise of a chess player. The strongest of them all, Bhim, decides to be the court entertainer by fighting against bulls and elephants. Arjun, The great archer dresses up as a woman and uses his agility to teach dancing to the ladies of the palace. The youngest ones, Nokul and Shahudev, being good with animals, disguise themselves as caretakers of the king's horses and cattle. Now, you, my dear audience, did you notice what just happened? How the stories that Pandavas know about themselves influenced their decisions when they had to assume a new identity? This seems like an interesting junction to pause for a moment and reflect how stories shape our thoughts and thereby our identities. Let us explore this idea together with our esteemed speaker of this evening, who is joining us all the way from York University in Toronto. Presenting to you, Dr. Budhika Belana.
Hi, folks. Just give me 1 second. Here are my slides. So I'm super excited to be here. I hope you can all hear me well. And my name is Budhika Balana, and I'm a professor in the Department of Psychology at the Glendon campus of York University from Toronto, Canada. I wish I could be in Lisbon right now, but I'm still excited to give you this presentation, which is Stories as Tools for Scientists of the Mind and Brain. So, as you may have heard, I am a cognitive neuroscientist, which means I study the mind and the brain, and specifically how our brain, this organ, gives rise to our mental experience. And this, as we can tell, has been a meeting about stories. So a question that you might have is, why am I, a cognitive neuroscientist, here? And to articulate, I think, the importance of stories for cognitive neuroscientists and psychologists, people interested in the mind and brain, I'd like to read you a short story. And this is one by Lydia Davis called Odd Behavior. And in fact, it's flash fiction. So this is the story in its entirety. And if you'll allow me, I'll read it to you. You see how circumstances are to blame. I am not really an odd person if I put more and more small pieces of shredded Kleenex in my ears and tie a scarf around my head. When I lived alone, I had all the silence I needed. So, that is Odd Behavior by Lydia Davis. And one way to concretely describe what this story is to call it 46 words. So in fact, that story was composed of precisely 46 words, and you could even look at the specific words that are used. So here is a frequency graph. The y-axis, so up and down, highlights all the unique words that were used in this story, all the 46 words, while the x-axis, left to right, highlights how frequently a given word is used. So in some sense, this story, Odd Behavior by Lydia Davis, could be described as 46 words where the word I was used quite a lot. This is a concrete description of this story. However, as you might notice, it feels like a silly description. It misses something perhaps essential about what the story actually did. So maybe you, as a reader, in listening to this story, perhaps imagined a person covering their ears, stressed, hiding from the world around them. And maybe the sentence, put more and more small pieces of shredded Kleenex in my ears, had you actually visualizing, imagining these pieces of Kleenex and a person stuffing them in their ears. And maybe the sentence, you see how circumstances are to blame, had you wondering, what could the circumstances possibly be to make this person put Kleenex in their ears? And maybe you would ask yourself, what circumstances would be necessary for me to do the same? And this highlights, I think, this juxtaposition between the concrete description of odd behavior is 46 words. And this idea that from these words, stories build worlds. So stories have this ability to transport us away from our immediate surroundings and into fully fleshed out our alternate worlds. And I think this is a really interesting phenomenon for researchers who are interested in things like remembering or imagining. And if you're interested in this ability to take words and build worlds feels like a really key phenomenon to focus on. And also, I would like to argue over the course of this talk is that stories provide actually a really useful tool to be able to bring this incredible ability that we have to build worlds into our labs as scientists to do research about how the mind and brain work. So, in this talk, I'm going to try to make the case that stories are a useful tool for researchers who are interested in the mind and the brain. They can reveal how our minds and brains work. And I'm going to highlight just two features. This is a short talk, so just two aspects of stories that I think make them particularly valuable for understanding how our minds and brains work. One is that stories synchronize us with other people. And the second is that stories carry momentum. And we're going to talk about the first point first, how stories synchronize our minds and brains. So I talked about this idea that stories have the ability to transport us into alternate worlds. But imagine the case of a movie. In a movie theater, you're with other people, everyone simultaneously watching a story unfold. Similar thing could happen with listening to an audiobook as long as multiple people are doing it in this way that unfolds over time. What it actually means is that stories have this ability to also transport us into shared worlds. And then a question that you might wonder is how does the brain or mind give rise to this shared experience? Can we measure it? And work pioneered by Uri Hassan, a neuroscientist from Princeton, used a technique called intersubject correlation to get at this question exactly. So what they did was they had participants go into a magnetic resonance imaging scanner, so a brain scanner. And what they would look at or have participants do is individually watch a movie or listen to a story. And then they would show this same movie or story to different people. And they would take this brain imaging tool, fMRI for short, and look at brain activity in a given voxel in the brain. So that's a three-dimensional pixel. So they would point to a specific point in the brain, and they would look at the brain activity while a person watched the movie. But then they would also show this movie to another person, let's say person B, and find that very same point in the brain, that very same voxel, and look at its activity over time too. And then what they would do is literally look at how similar were the time courses of activity, or the dynamics of the activity. Did activity in the brain, in these voxels across people, go up and down at similar times? This is the idea of intersubject correlation. And the thing is, if the two people were not doing the same thing, there's no reason for them to show synchronized brain activity. But if they're watching the same movie, now you have a stimulus, something that's causing a shared experience. And you can measure which parts of the brain track this shared experience. And the interesting thing about intersubject correlation is that you can actually change what you show participants and change who the participants are to help you unpack which parts of the brain care about which parts of shared experience. So imagine a scenario where you had participants in a brain scanner and you had them listen to an audiobook. And say your participants were Anglophones, people who spoke English, and the audiobook was in English. Then one question that you could ask is what's shared across these two people? First, it would be the auditory information, the sounds that these participants hear. That's literally shared. They're hearing the same thing. But another thing that's shared is the actual story. that those sounds entail. They're hearing words, and from those words, they're building worlds. So you can look and detect which parts of the brain care about these shared experiences. But you could also do something slightly different. You could swap the participants so that you have a Russian speaker and an English speaker, and say you have them listen to an audiobook in Russian. Now you could ask the same question: what's shared across people? And what you'll notice is that the story content here wouldn't be shared. The English speaker who doesn't understand Russian wouldn't understand what's being said. But what would be shared would be the auditory information. They're hearing the literal same sounds. So by using this comparison, you'd be able to see what parts of the brain track auditory information. And you could even do this interesting comparison. Say you had the Russian speaker listen to a Russian audiobook, and you had the English speaker listen to the exact same audiobook, but translated into English. What's shared across these two individuals? Well, the auditory information is not shared. Russian doesn't sound like English, so that is not shared across these two people. But what is shared now is the narrative content, the story itself. So, using this, you'd be able to see which parts of the brain track shared experience of narrative content. And that's exactly what a study by Honey and colleagues in 2012 did. This is an old study, but I think it captures this idea quite well. So they had participants listen to a short story, and they compared and calculated the intersubject correlation across English speakers. So here, remember, an English story, and what's shared across English speakers is the auditory information and story content. And when you look to see, do any parts of the brain show synchrony across individuals, show a similar pattern of activity, time course of activity, you see that many parts of the brain, all these orange-colored areas, were actually synchronized while different people were listening to the same story. But they also did the other two conditions that I described. They had Russian speakers listen to a Russian story, and English speakers also listen to a Russian story. And what's shared across people here? Just auditory information, right? The English speaker doesn't understand the story despite the fact that the Russian speaker does. So what you'll notice is the synchrony in the brain is considerably reduced. There's much less parts of the brain that seem to show moment-to-moment synchrony. And instead, it's restricted to these small little orange areas right here, which happen to be early auditory cortex, parts of the brain that are supposed to be tracking our auditory information that comes from the external world. And they also did the final condition, where they compare the Russian story for Russian speakers to English story for English speakers. Here, the only thing that's shared across participants is the narrative content and not the auditory information. And what you'll notice is there isn't much synchrony in the auditory cortex, which is aligned in the red outline here, but instead it's in a whole network of brain areas that we would commonly refer to as the default mode network, a set of brain areas often thought to be involved in how we understand and interpret the world around us. And while that study was from 2012, there's actually a recent special issue that came out about what the role of the default mode network might be, that came out just this year. And if you look at all the different opinion pieces from all the different scientists in this issue, over 50% of the articles discussed research using stories as stimuli, and emphasizing the importance or the utility of this synchrony idea, the fact that stories synchronize us to help us understand how different parts of the brain might work. So that gives you a concrete example, hopefully, of how stories have a feature that can help us learn about the mind and brain. And the other one I want to talk about is the idea that stories carry momentum. And this is something that my research in my lab actually focuses on. So to highlight the idea of momentum, I'm going to read this little screenshot from Reddit to you. So there was a post under the subreddit R Books where somebody asked, does reading a book change who you are temporarily? And a person named Alphabet278 said the following: just finished Angels and Demons by Dan Brown, and I've been in a trance for hours. My girlfriend can't even communicate properly with me because I seem to phase out every now and then. And then I realized that I was thinking about everything that happened in the book. This is a common feeling after you finish reading a story, that when you put it down, the story still continues to shape what you think about. Another way people have described this idea is with the concept of a book hangover. Some people feel unable to start a new book because they're still living in the last book's world. And this idea is not even specific to stories. Some of our experiences more generally seem to have this kind of momentum, a propensity to carry forward in time. Think about a socially awkward or embarrassing experience. That experience might end, but you can often find yourself thinking about it for minutes, hours, sometimes weeks or years after that experience ends. Similar things happen for emotional experiences. So human thought seems to have this propensity to carry forward in time. But it's difficult to study this phenomenon, and it's difficult to elicit it in the laboratory. Therefore, there's a gap in terms of why and how this momentum arises. What kinds of experiences elicit this and why? And we tried to use stories as a tool to bring this momentum phenomenon into the laboratory to try to study how it works. And this is work I did with my colleagues Chris Honey and Abhijit Mahbal. So what we did was we had participants read a short story at their own pace. And the one we chose was So Much Water, So Close to Home by Raymond Carver, which I can talk about if anyone's interested. But what we did is we reasoned that if stories have some ability to carry forward in time, we need some way to measure what's on people's minds. And to that end, we had participants do free association, where they literally typed whatever words came to mind as they came to mind for 5 minutes before and after reading the story. And if you ever try free association, you'll notice that you can't generate random words. The words that you come up with are the words that's on your mind. I, at the end, if you saw, wrote the word sushi because at the time I was hungry. So what's on our mind seems to be captured by the words that we find, that we randomly generate. So if that's true, and stories have this propensity to carry forward, this momentum, then perhaps we should be able to see a change in the content of free association after reading the story as compared to before. And we reason that this might be strongest when people read immersive stories, ones that are really able to transport us into alternate worlds. And to test that idea, we had some participants read a coherent story where it was in the same form in which it was published, the one by Raymond Carver, as it was published, versus other participants reading a sentence-scrambled version of that story. So the same story, but now the sentences are in random order. So it makes some sense, but doesn't tell you a coherent, immersive story fully, just glimpses. And a word-scrambled version, where now the words themselves are in random order. So here you can't even make heads or tails or sense at all of the story, but the word content is the same. So the question essentially becomes, can you tell the difference between free association before and after? And is that difference largest when the story is most immersive, when it's intact, versus sentence-scrambled or word-scrambled? To analyze these data, we turn to computer science, actually one of the precursors of the large language models that exist today, and it's the idea of word embeddings. So what word embeddings briefly let you do is take a word and represent them as a series of numbers. And those numbers can be thought of as a coordinate in space. And the interesting thing about what word embeddings do is that words with similar meanings will have similar coordinates in space. And you can kind of roughly think of this as if you took a dictionary and flattened it and turned it into a map. Words with similar meanings will live in similar points in space. And if you think about this in the context of free association, then what we're able to do is take free association data and plot it in space to actually visualize how a participant's thoughts, their stream of thought, unfolded in time. So here you can see some thoughts. They tend to be about vehicles, and then they move to a different topic, which is about animals. So we're able to now see their thoughts as they move through space. And then with this technique, what you can do is take a given word that a participant generated, and plot all of the core themes of the story in this space as well, and then measure how close that thought was to the story themes and capture how close it got, the closest it got, every thought got to the story itself. And if you do that for free association before reading and after, what you essentially have is now a measure of how close free associates are to the story themes before, pre, or after, post reading the story, where higher values mean that the associates are closer to the story themes. And what I'm plotting here is the data from our participants. And what you can see, each participant has a point for before reading the story pre and after reading the story post, and lines connecting them. And what you can see is that free associates that participants generate after reading the story tend to be closer, higher to the story themes. And this was less the case when participants read the sentence scrambled version of the story, and not at all the case when participants read the word scrambled version of the story, suggesting that the intact story seems to be able to shape what people think about. And we found this in another set of data with different participants. We found the same thing with a different version of the same Carver story, and we even found it with a different story entirely, all highlighting this intact condition, showing more of this persistence, momentum in terms of people's thoughts. So story content persists in our post-story thoughts, and especially when stories are coherent. And by virtue of bringing it into the lab, we're able to show many different aspects of how this momentum works. We found that the extent to which you as an individual felt immersed in the story, irrespective of its objective coherence, seemed to be the strongest determinant of momentum. We found that you can reduce momentum with instruction, you can increase it with other kinds of instruction, and we found that once it starts, it's difficult to reduce. So to come back to the general phenomenon, some experiences seem to carry this kind of psychological momentum. And I think this is an important aspect of how humans think. And stories were the way that we were able to bring this phenomenon into the laboratory, to poke it and learn about how it works. So to come back, I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. This is a meeting about stories. Why am I here? Stories, as I hopefully have illustrated, can transport us into alternate worlds. And this is a key, interesting phenomenon and tool for scientists of the mind and brain. And I would even go beyond saying interesting to say essential. If we cognitive neuroscientists and psychologists are trying to understand how we remember, how we imagine, how language works, stories provide such a powerful example of our abilities to be able to take words and build entire worlds. And if we're trying to have a complete picture of how human thought works, understanding stories seems like a valuable starting point. And similarly, or end goal rather, and stories provide a vehicle to actually bring that rich meaning into our science. So I wanted to say thank you for listening. Thank you to my collaborators and my funding organizations, and also my lab for supporting me in the research that we do.
Thank you, Bodhika, for showing how stories transport us to another world. Let us too travel back to our 5 brothers. Having successfully completed their final year of exile in disguise, they are now eager to get back what they believe is rightfully theirs. They know that the Kauravas will not be willing to give up the kingdom so easily. Still, they decide to try to negotiate peacefully as a first step. Parallelly, they also start preparing for a conflict in case the negotiations fail. But how would 5 brothers, that too in banishment from their own homeland, manage to put up a fight against an entire kingdom? The truth is, they are not ordinary mortals like you and me. Instead, To know a bit more about their identities, let us journey back in time when their father, King Pandu, was a young man. If you remember, King Pandu had been ruling the kingdom in place of his elder brother, who was born blind. And King Pandu's rule had been highly effective. He had successfully managed to protect the kingdom from all invasions, as well as amass huge wealth by winning wars. Feeling tired from all these battles and the daily grind of his court life, the young king decided to go on a hunting trip. While out hunting, he thought he saw a deer couple hidden among the foliage and shot his arrow to kill both. However, what he mistook as a deer couple was in reality a wise, learned sage and his wife. Hearing their anguished cries, King Pandu ran towards them to see if they could still be saved. But alas, it was already too late. Through his last breaths, the angry sage saw his killer and cursed him. Pandu, you will drop dead the very moment you try making love. Hearing this, the king was devastated. It meant having no children. With great sorrow, he went to his queen to relate this incident. However, Kunti was not bothered as much, for she had a secret that she was keeping from her king. She decided now was the time to reveal it. Consoling the king, she said, "My king, do not worry, since what is done cannot be reversed. However, even if you cannot sire children, I can." Sorry. Long back, when I was a young girl, an old sage had taken refuge at my father's residence. I had taken very good care of him, so in return he offered me a gift. I can chant a hymn to call any god and have a child with him. This brightened up the king immensely. "Oh dear, that is great news! What are you waiting for? You should summon a god immediately." The queen in turn asked, "Do you have anyone particular in mind?" The king pondered for a while before deciding on Dharma, the god of righteousness. The queen agreed with the proposal, and thus they had their first son, Yudhishthir, who was actually a son of Dharma and the queen. But King Pandu was still not satisfied. So, not long after, he called back the queen. "You know, one son is equivalent to no son. What if Yudhishthir gets killed in a battle? We should have more children." So one by one, the queen called for the gods of wind, fire, and health to have Bhim, Arjun, and the twins, Nokul and Shahudev. Calling for help from either the divine or the demonic is not a unique concept in the world literature. So why don't we pause again for a little while and hear about this more from our next guest speaker, Dr. Joe Stubbersfield from the University of Winchester. Please join me in welcoming him.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. So, I'm going to be talking about a slightly less classical or maybe less highbrow story about the urban legend of Bloody Mary and what this can tell us about what makes stories stick in our minds. So we're going to start off with the tale itself. So some of you may have not heard of this or heard other versions, but this is the actual true version. And it starts hundreds of years ago in Lisbon, where there was a beautiful but very vain noblewoman called Maria. And one day she was in a terrible coach crash. You can see the shattered remnants of her coach in the Coach Museum, just also in Belém. And she was left terribly scarred. And she couldn't live with herself to have such scarring. So one day she looked into a mirror for the very last time, cut her throat, and threw herself from Belém Tower into the water below. But her spirit lies restless, and to this day, if you go into a darkened room with a candle before a mirror and say her name 3 times, then she will appear before you, and if you don't blow out the candle quick enough, she will scar your face just like she was done in that terrible accident. So I think in the interests of science, we should test that today. It's not quite the perfect conditions. This is the best I can do, really, with a candle. So if you don't mind just saying, and we'll say Bloody Mary, because they have Duolingo in hell, so it's fine to use the English. So if you could just say, Bloody Mary. Don't worry, it's just a story. Don't be scared. So this was a kind of a popular urban legend. It's kind of spread around the world, starting, a kind of 20th century urban legend. Has its origins in older folklore from the UK. So there used to be a tradition in the UK that on Halloween, a woman could go before a mirror with a candle, perform kind of rituals, and it would allow her to see the face of her future husband. If she'd be unfortunate enough to die without marrying, then she would see the face of something horrific like the Grim Reaper. Or in this case, this woman unfortunate enough to be marrying an ugly man in this card. So these are greetings cards from the 19th century depicting this, this kind of tradition. Also, it's mentioned by Robert Burns in a poem of his. Also, the story of Bloody Mary might have related to older kind of folklore related to mirrors, a kind of warning against vanity, that if you stare into a mirror for too long, you'll see the devil, and you'll perhaps see that it's not the devil's face that the woman is seeing in the mirror. So yeah, it has from this kind of older tradition, but at some point it kind of evolved into this story of Bloody Mary in America, then kind of spread around the world and inspired a lot of quite bad horror films that you're probably not familiar with. But a more famous, kind of more successful inspiration are the Candyman films, so the kind of traditional one, the old one from the 90s, more recent remake, which are very much inspired by the study of Bloody Mary. You say Candyman 5 times and he appears and attacks you. And those are the more recommendable versions of this kind of story that if you want to see a film of it. So the story I said before is a somewhat embellished version of the kind of story, but this is a kind of basic text. And what it's great about this story is it's an interesting way to kind of examine how psychology, what aspects of psychology might make a story sticky, essentially, what might make it stay in our memory. And what's interesting is the story is often divided into kind of 3 key parts. So we have a kind of origin of the supernatural figure, the ritual itself that's done to summon them, and then the actions of the ghost. So we're going to go through all of those kind of sections and see what they kind of tell us about what makes stories stick. So we're going to start with the origin of the ghost, and this is where we see the most variation across different versions of Bloody Mary. So in a lot of versions, the Bloody Mary character is Mary Worth, not an actual historical figure, but within the story, the kind of background is that she's a witch executed in the Salem witch trials. Sometimes she's a woman who murdered, escaped enslaved people. Mary Wales is another version, who's a child murdered by an abusive father. The Bell Witch is an interesting example of a kind of local folkloric figure that gets attached to the tale. So she is a kind of folkloric figure within the southern states of America, particularly Tennessee, the inspiration behind the Blair Witch. In the UK, sometimes gets attached to Queen Mary I, who was nicknamed Bloody Mary by Protestants because of her actions. Actually, kind of coincidentally, so there's no real, the origins of the kind of folklore don't lie in Queen Mary I, but they've kind of got connected because of the coincidental name sharing. Couldn't find a kind of proper Portuguese version, but when I was searching online, I did find the kind of Brazilian version. So I think this is the blonde in the bathroom in the Portuguese. So a lot of this is from a Brazilian film of this folklore. And a lot of these ghosts appear in bathrooms because that's where you go if you're a teenager to find mirrors, essentially. And this kind of variation in folklore is something we see a lot of. So in this work by Jamie Tarani, looking at Red Riding Hood, you see a lot of, so looking at kind of international variations of Red Riding Hood, you see how they fit to the local context, essentially. So in East Asia, it tends not to be a wolf that disguises a grandma, but a tiger. You also get kind of traditional folklore, kind of ogre-type characters within African versions. And for example, in countries where it might be unusual for a young girl to be out on her own, it would be changed to a boy and so on. So you see these variations that fit to the local context. So why might we expect to see these variations? Why does that help a story be sticky? So one of the reasons we might expect to see these changes is it helps with a story be more memorable. So this is Frederick Bartlett, who is a British psychologist who was kind of doing experimental work, particularly on memory, but in relation to stories and storytelling about 100 years ago in the kind of 1930s. And one of his more famous experiments, he used a Native American folk tale called The War of the Ghosts, and he gave that to participants who, in his study, were kind of 1930s, I think Cambridge University students, had them remember it over and over again, sometimes with long gaps between recall, or have one person remember it and then that would be passed on to another person. And through those processes of memory, he found that the story became conventionalized, essentially. So the more unfamiliar parts of the story, so there'd be lots of aspects of Native American culture which would be unfamiliar to 1930s British students. They would become changed to become more familiar aspects that would be more familiar and better recalled by those participants. So some of it is just fitting to our expectations, and that just makes it a bit more memorable. Another thing I think, particularly when it comes to localization and for scary stories like Bloody Mary, is that for it to have more of an emotional impact, it makes more sense if the threat is local rather than somewhere far away. Bloody Mary is much less scary if she's a ghost haunting North America compared to Lisbon. So that kind of localization is something you see a lot in urban legends dealing with threats, because it'll have more of an emotional response and therefore be more memorable if the threat is local rather than distant. Okay, so now we'll move on to the ritual, which, again, you see variation, but there's several really kind of key elements to the story. So one is the presence of a mirror, also dim lighting, often lit by candlelight, and that repeated phrase, often the name of the supernatural figure. And I think the presence of the mirror is really important because it ties the Bloody Mary urban legend to kind of thousands of years of traditional folklore and folkloric traditions. So going back to kind of ancient Greek oracles, this kind of use of reflections, this use of mirrors is very common in divination, and also more widely in storytelling, folklore, literature. We see mirrors as these kind of connections to the supernatural. But what might we understand about the kind of appeal of the supernatural within storytelling? So one way that this has been approached by cognitive anthropologists and psychologists is to engage with the kind of a concept of counterintuitiveness. So the idea essentially is that humans have intuitive assumptions or intuitive expectations about the world around us, called folk biology, folk physics, and folk psychology. And essentially this is within categories there are certain expectations. So say for folk biology, if we expect living creatures will grow old and die, they need sustenance to live, things like that. With folk physics, we expect that solid objects can't co-occupy the same space. Something that's heavy will fall to the ground if it's dropped. Folk psychology suggests there are kind of limits to what we can know. We're limited to our own experiences and understanding. And concepts which breach those expectations are counterintuitive, and these are essentially what you will get kind of supernatural figures. So being able to transform into a different being, or a wolf that can talk, breaches folk biology. Ghosts and their ability to kind of pass through walls breaches our concepts of folk physics. Characters that might be able to see beyond, into the future or into the minds of others breach concepts of folk psychology. And generally speaking, these kind of counterintuitive concepts are particularly successful in memory, so we see them in experiments. They're better remembered than more intuitive concepts. And in examining examples of folklore, like traditional folk tales, though, we see that it's not the more counterintuitive it is, the better it's recalled, but actually there's an interesting balance that's to be found. So for the kind of maximally best remembered stories combine a relatively small number of counterintuitive concepts and kind of embedded within a more intuitive kind of context, essentially. So there'll be more intuitive kind of everyday kind of goings on, and there'll be these kind of supernatural, these kind of counterintuitive concepts within it. So this is has become known as minimally counterintuitive bias, because you need a kind of relatively small number of counterintuitive concepts. And in a kind of context analysis of different versions of Bloody Mary that I conducted with some colleagues, we found that it kind of fit with this cognitive optimum which has been suggested of 1 to 4 counterintuitive concepts within that broader framework. My Brittany thing is falling down. So relatively small number of counterintuitive concepts or supernatural elements in a kind of wider intuitive framework. So now moving on to the ghost's actions. So typically speaking, or well, kind of always, the ghost doesn't have any good intentions. They're always malign, they're always going to attack you. Sometimes there are ways of escaping, like blowing out the candle or like a ring of salt, that kind of stuff. But always the ghost is trying to attack you. I think what's interesting about this, if you remember the kind of perhaps origins of this story are in a traditional folklore where the outcome was potentially good. You know, you could see your future husband, but it potentially had a negative outcome. So how do we go from something which is kind of mixed, largely positive, to kind of entirely negative? All this ritual does now is to summon a terrible ghost. So one of the reasons I think this might be is a kind of quite wide phenomena that's been found or kind of well supported in psychology, which is a negativity bias. So we see this that in kind of memory, attention, recall, all kinds of different aspects show this kind of advantage for content which evokes negative emotions. So this is from and we see this reflected in the content of various kind of cultural items. So this is from an assessment by Alberto Acerbi of fake news, so a kind of very contemporary version of storytelling, where the vast majority, perhaps intuitively as you might expect, are evoking negative emotions. We also see this in kind of tests of memory. So in this study by Bebbington and colleagues, they, similar to the kind of tradition that Bartlett started kind of almost 100 years ago, using this kind of telephone game style experiment where people recall something and it's passed on to another, we found that the kind of negative content was much more successfully preserved along these chains compared to positive events within a story. And that's particularly true if the negative emotion is associated with threat. So threat is particularly potent within these kind of stories. And so we see another experiment where people chose what kind of information to pass on to another people, similar kind of transmission chain study, that negative had some advantage over neutral information, but by far the most successful was threat-related information. And we see that reflected in a whole range of different stories. So kind of traditional folklore and fairy tales often deal with threat. Other urban legends like alligators growing in the sewer, films, whether they engage with kind of disasters or serial killers that are after us. A lot of these kind of successful narratives engage with telling us about threats of some kind. So what can we learn from Bloody Mary about what makes a story successful, or what might make it stick? So it fitting to cultural expectations, adapting to a local environment, so it perhaps is more emotionally resonant, or at least more memorable because it fits with that expectation. Some supernatural elements, but not too much, so a kind of, an element of the supernatural, but not going too crazy with it. It seems to make things successful. And the evoking of negative emotions, particularly fear and kind of response to threat. These are the kind of things we can learn from Bloody Mary that seem to make stories more successful and make them stick. So thank you very much for listening. And this is a cartoon if you're expecting something more about the cocktail. And thanks very much.
Thank you, Joe, for sharing your thoughts on what makes some stories endure longer than others. Continuing with our story, as expected, the Kauravas refused to share the kingdom with their cousins when asked. According to them, as Pandavas were sons of gods, they did not belong to the Kuru dynasty. Hence, their claim to the throne was not justified. Even their names reflected this fact. The Kauravas were called so because they were princes of the Kuru lineage, unlike the Pandavas. Still, many believed that the Pandavas were the rightful kings. After all, they were the sons of gods. Hence, when the Pandavas sent their emissaries to ask for help, many of the powerful kingdoms chose to align with them. So, as the negotiations failed, both sides started preparing for what would eventually be known as the Great War of Kurukshetra. Now, let me ask you, who do you think should win this war? Who would you like to be crowned as the next rulers? On one side, we have our Kauravas, the true descendants of the royal lineage. But as you have just seen for yourselves, they will stop at nothing to remain in power. On the other side stands our brave heroes, the Pandavas, so bound by duty and honor that they are willing to lose everything in a rigged game of dice. And perhaps this is why some stories turn out to be so enduring, because sometimes they are not merely a simple tale of good versus evil with clear winners. Instead, they weave a nuanced narrative of flawed human characters. Still, if you're really curious to know about the true ending of the story, it is inspired by a tale that millions of children still grow up learning every year. This story that I have been telling you tonight is based on the epic of Mahabharata. Thank you. And now I would like to ask the speakers of tonight to join me for a short Q&A round. Thanks. So for the first question, it is actually for Buddhika. Can you hear me?
But we cannot hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can.
Yes. Can you hear me as well?
Yes.
Okay. The first question is for you. Did you study people who speak the same language but have different mother tongues? If yes, what did you find?
I have not done that, and I'm actually not too familiar of that much work that has looked at bilingualism in that case. But in the specific study that I was talking about by Chris Honey and colleagues in 2012 rather, the speakers were English, or the Russian speakers spoke both English and Russian. So they did have a little bit of that. But the interesting thing, I think, is that when you speak a different language, the kind of world that you're able to build from the words is likely going to be different. The cultural context that the words might evoke might be different across native speakers versus somebody who is less immersed in that language. And with the synchrony brain stuff that I was showing you, the emphasis is on what's similar across people. So it wouldn't really always capture all that nuance that different languages and the cultural context you're embedded in, how that might contribute to the world that you build. But I think that's a really interesting question. It would be really cool to be able to capture that property.
Thank you. I would like to ask the next question to Joe. If stories tend to stick better with us when they present minimally counterintuitive concepts, how can we explain more intuitive stories sticking as well? For instance, those who build from very familiar and logical settings and end up sticking with us due to their proximity, like Fahrenheit 451 or Orwell's 1984.
Yeah, I think that's it's a great question. I guess there would be potentially other. I mean, I suppose the MCI stuff particularly relates to perhaps oral-based traditions where recall is important. I suppose those two examples would be kind of literary traditions where memory is not so important. And I think successful orally transmitted, like The Smith and the Devil, these kind of stories which survive for thousands of years tend to contain some kind of element of the supernatural. That said, like the intuitive part is obviously very important. And you see, I mean, one of the biases that people have examined by looking at or various things like stories, but also experimentally, is things like social information. So having information about relationships, about kind of betrayals, coalitions, that kind of thing. Those kind of stories are also found to be very successful in orally or otherwise, recall-based. So there are other aspects of, there are other biases which can be evoked in stories which may help preserve it and may particularly relate to, very much the kind of day-to-day, soap opera stuff is very much those kind of social interactions which are very also very appealing.
Thanks. Going back to Buddhika, I have this question from the audience. In your view and given your findings, could stories, storytelling, and the act of reading actually induce neuroplasticity and with time benefit in awareness and its understanding?
Really interesting. I think there's some potential truth to that, whether or not it depends on what we mean by neuroplasticity. But I do think that there is a lot of interesting work that shows that narratives are a particularly powerful tool for communicating ideas. For example, changing someone's opinion about a long-held belief has been demonstrated to be more effective when the argument has been presented in a narrative format relating to people and their goals versus being presented in a fact kind of format. And if that's true, then that would suggest that stories have some kind of fast route into shaping what we think about and what we believe, which would have to have some kind of neural basis, which would be related to your point about neuroplasticity. So I do think, yes, stories have some ability to persist in our minds and shape what we think about and shape what we believe in a way that seems to be different from other kinds of materials. And yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I hope you do too.
Thank you. Back to Joe again. There is a question that asks, is there a way to be appealing that is not fear? Do you have a theory why negative emotional content makes a story stick more than a positive one?
So the advantage for negative content has usually been explained as a kind of product of evolution, essentially that paying attention to, and particularly related to the kind of threat-related information, that our perceptual systems are going to be orientated towards potential threats because avoiding a threat is always going to be more beneficial than missing a potential benefit. So you want a kind of overreactive alarm system, and you want to pay attention to things that are potentially threatening in the environment. So that's certainly generally how the kind of negativity bias is explained, or the kind of origins of that. But I guess in terms of kind of positivity and making those kind of things stick, I think it's important to remember that an emotional reaction in general, whether that be positive or negative, will tend to make a story more sticky. So, the kind of work I did on Bloody Mary was part of a wider project looking at urban legends. A lot of urban legends are actually just kind of funny stories. And humor, making people laugh, is a good way also of making a story stick, essentially. It's maybe harder to make people laugh consistently than be disgusted. So maybe that's why we see, and there's also potentially quite a lot of crossover with disgust and humor as well. but yeah, maybe evoking negative emotions might be easier than making people laugh potentially, but you still do see particularly funny stories being successful.
We have a question for Lydia. What is the most powerful finding you came across on storytelling?
Oh, most powerful. That's a difficult question.
Okay,
I
do
would
you
say
want to?
that the things they know better powerful. Because I don't do research into storytelling. I just made like this talk about it because I'm really interested in it. But the most powerful now, like on the spot.
We can come back to you.
Okay.
Can I venture? So I think
okay,
one of the
good.
things you talked about was the work on The Smith and the Devil. So my PhD supervisor, Jamie Tarani, worked on that project. I think one of the reasons why that's so powerful is that, as an audience received that story from Lydia, that puts you in a line going back potentially 30,000 years of people sharing that story in a chain. And I think that's incredibly powerful, how we are part of that incredible lineage now, going back across cultures, across time, across languages. That story is preserved over such a long time, and I think it really demonstrates the kind of power of stories, and we're all part of that now.
Thank you. We have a question that can be answered by anybody. It's addressed to all. And it's a long one, actually. But let's go through it. Don't you feel that the world's current political agents are precisely using the ingredients of a story that sticks, cultural expectations, emotion, supernatural, rather than evidence elements and lots of negative emotional content, like fear and threat, to manipulate voters? But most importantly, how can we use the power of stories to build a better, fairer world for all?
I took the last one. So.
I can give it a shot. I think when research highlights that stories are memorable, that they stick in your minds, that they're even persistent in the form of over time, as as Joe and Lydia even described in terms of story lineages. These kind of I think capture some aspect of us. We tend to understand information well when it's presented in this format. It doesn't, though, mean that only one type of narrative is effective. You can have whatever message you want crafted in a different way in this kind of format and potentially have it be more readily understood or better remembered. So I think research on stories just highlights the importance of the form. And what the exact message is, I think, is up to us to determine. And hopefully that is a bit hopeful.
There is another question for all, whoever would like to answer. It appears that you took a structuralist approach to story. J.R.R. Tolkien contests this approach in his lecture on fairy tales, saying that the elements that you throw in the soup, that is the story, are as important as the enduring matrix of the story. So I ask, when a story evolves through time and acquires new traits, is it still the same story?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And yeah, I mean, certainly a lot of that work by Jamie Tarani, and also something the wider project I did on Bloody Mary, a key part of that, if you're trying to determine how a story evolves, is how do you determine the kind of core of the narrative. There's a fairly long tradition in folkloristics on this kind of stuff. So, I mean, I know Jamie uses the Arne Thompson-Uther index, which essentially is quite I'm starting to veer away from my knowledge here, but it kind of establishes these kind of core, particularly in terms of fairy tales, these kind of core of the narratives that then allows you to kind of assess different versions. I guess that it comes down to a degree of subjectivity, I guess, in trying to determine what makes the story. So certainly when I was looking at Bloody Mary, I decided, okay, what are the core aspects? So, you know, it's a kind of mirror divination ritual where a being is summoned, and essentially use that as the kind of central aspect to then gather different versions, essentially. And that's kind of how people approach it, which may or may not be ideal, but that's kind of how it's done. But yeah, it's a huge challenge for this kind of work, and certainly the kind of the Red Riding Hood stuff that Jamie did was kind of partly the motivation for that, was to create an answer to a long-standing debate in folklore as to whether there were two narratives, you know, whether Red Riding Hood was the same story as, I think it's called the Something and the Goats, the Ogre and the Goats, something like that. Were they the same story or not? And through his work, he kind of suggested that they are in fact the same story because they have the same evolutionary they have the same kind of point of origin. They're both they kind of evolved from an Aesop's fable, and so from that he suggests that they are the same narrative. But yeah, it is a huge challenge when you're kind of doing, you know, comparative folkloristics. Essentially, it's how do you tell is hard. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's a good note to end the event today. Let us thank our speakers once more. And if you would like to ask Joe and Lydia more questions, we'll be right outside.
Thank you.
Thank you.